Hey everyone, Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton here with a special Thanksgiving update. Thank you as always for your support of Judicial Watch. We're grateful and thankful for it. You know, I thought for this weekly update, it's a holiday edition, it would be useful and educational, and I think something you'd enjoy to see our major new documentary that was released last month, Censored and Controlled. It's about the deep state, the Biden administration, you name it, their coordinated and collusive efforts with big tech to censor Americans on issues ranging from election integrity to Hunter Biden's laptop to the COVID controversies. Censorship and pressure that continues to this day. This documentary does a deep dive into the Twitter files that help expose a lot of this, and some of other Judicial Watch's investigations that uncovered censorship of American citizens that in many ways helped rig an election, one could argue, in 2020. As we go into next year, 2024, it's important to understand those forces that want to suppress the First Amendment and censor you, especially in an election year. So I encourage you to call all your friends and family into the room now and enjoy the Censored and Controlled documentary from Judicial Watch.
Thanks to Elon Musk's release of the Twitter files.
Twitter files.
On October 14, 2020, Twitter blocks the New York Post story on Hunter Biden and suspends their account.
The potential power of big tech.
Twitter has de-amplified.
Shadow ban.
Got censored too
Censor.
much.
Censoring information that was true.
I'm here today because of a series of events that began late last year when I received a note from a source online. It read, "Are you interested in doing a deep dive into what censorship and manipulation is going on at Twitter?"
Clear that Republicans were targeted.
Kinds of statements were
Today,
suppressed.
American taxpayers are unwittingly financing the growth and power of a censorship industrial complex.
Unfortunately, our own government appears to be playing a lead role.
The Twitter files, state attorneys general lawsuits, and investigative reporters have revealed a large and growing network of government agencies, academic institutions, and non-governmental organizations that are actively censoring American citizens, often without their knowledge, on a range of issues.
Twitter worked overtime to suppress accurate COVID information.
We learned Twitter, Facebook, Google, and other companies developed a formal system for taking in moderation requests from every corner of government, from the FBI, the DHS, the HHS, DOD, the Global Engagement Center at State, even the CIA.
Moreover, we know that the U.S. government has funded organizations that pressure advertisers to boycott news media organizations and social media platforms that refuse to censor and/or spread disinformation, including alleged conspiracy theories.
Another troubling aspect is the role of the press, which should be the people's last line of defense in such cases. But instead of investigating these groups, journalists partnered with them.
The censorship industrial complex combines established methods of psychological manipulation, some developed by the U.S. military during the global war on terror, with highly sophisticated tools from computer science, including artificial intelligence.
A focus of this fast-growing network is making lists of people whose opinions, beliefs, associations, or sympathies are deemed misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation. That last term is just a euphemism for true but inconvenient.
Would you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true?
But it was unusual and a little intimidating. You get up there, they intentionally design the hearing halls so that the members are looking down on you, and it's designed to put you ill at ease, and it works. You know, it's you're kind of off guard and you don't know exactly what's going to happen.
My understanding
So
is
I
that
didn't
they
ask a question. I didn't ask you a question, sir.
And you can't have it both ways, but let's move on.
Before you became Elon Musk's hand-picked journalist, and pardon the oxymoron.
In your answer, you also said that you were invited by a friend, Barry Weiss.
And the Republicans have brought in 2 of Elon Musk's public scribes.
She's a journalist.
Sir, I didn't ask you a question. So you're in this as a threesome?
The FBI had nothing to do with Twitter's decision to pause the New York Post story?
I am not aware of that.
I think the members saw Michael and me as people who, were traitors to the blue side.
Mr. Schellenberger, are you a Republican?
No, I'm not.
You got any, pro-Trump bumper stickers on your car?
I voted for Biden.
Voted for Biden. You know how many MAGA hats laying around your house, right?
I do not.
Yeah, but you said earlier, both you and Mr. Taibbi said this is the most chilling thing you've ever seen as journalists. Mr. Taibbi, the same thing. You're not a Republican either, are you?
No, I'm not.
And so there was a special ferocity in their approach to us. There was so much hostility, and it was so open, and they were so aggressive in not letting us answer.
Well, folks like Taibbi are considered to be, and Schellenberger, class traitors, right? Traitors to their left. They're typically, they were preachers of the left, journalists that have been seen to be of the left. And they've betrayed the left's goals, which is to abandon the First Amendment and cast any support for free speech aside in suppressing countless Americans to achieve their political ends.
Who gave you access to these emails? Who was the individual that gave you permission to access the emails? Did Mr. Musk place any conditions on the use of the email?
Would the gentlelady yield for a second?
As long as my time is not used.
Are you trying to get journalists?
No, I'm not trying to get.
Sources?
No, I'm not.
Well,
I am
sure
asking.
sounds like it.
No, well, if you will let me finish. Have you given all of the access to what you were given by your source to this committee?
No, I would never do that.
I just think this is interesting. First, the FTC is asking for your backgrounds, and now the ranking member of the Committee on the Weaponization of Government is asking for your sources. And then what really struck me is in the hearing, Democrat members of the committee asking 2 journalists to divulge their sources. I mean, it just further attack on the First Amendment, which was troubling. And then the final piece was, first these guys, get named by the FTC in a letter they send to Elon Musk or they send to Twitter. And these letters that the FTC is sending, they named 4 journalists personally. 2 of them are Taibbi and Schellenberger. We just happened, that same week we learned that, we just happened to be calling them in, having them in for a hearing. They come in and testify. Democrats ask them while they're testifying, who are your sources? Another attack on the First Amendment. And of course, while they're getting asked those kind of questions, the IRS was knocking on Matt Taibbi's door in New Jersey, at his home.
So when I first came home that night after testifying, and my wife showed me the note that had been left on the door by the IRS agent saying, the IRS came by our house today while you were testifying, my immediate thought was that had to be a coincidence. It was too ridiculous to imagine that there could be any connection whatsoever between the testimony and the IRS visiting. Then subsequently, a couple of things I learned convinced me that it may actually not be innocent.
If that's not intimidation, I don't know what is.
I found out that they opened the case on December 24th of 2022, which was Christmas Eve, a Saturday, and it was the day that I dropped probably the biggest Twitter files report about the DHS, the FBI, Office of the Director of National Intelligence.
You had the State Department, the CIA, the FBI, DHS, and HHS, all the president's men targeting Americans for censorship. And the broad nature of it is, to this day, astonishing. And what's really troublesome is that despite the Twitter files coming out, there's no reason to believe it stopped. That we've never seen anything like it in modern American history. You really have to go back to the first part of the last century under Woodrow Wilson, where he was jailing his political opponents and censoring speech. and of course the Alien and Sedition Acts back in the beginning of our nation's founding. But this is the worst censorship scandal, and I would say the worst censorship scandal in terms of scope, given the sheer volume of individuals who have been caught up in it.
I hate to bring up this comparison because it sounds over the top, but there's a great scene in All the President's Men where Bob Woodward is sitting in the courtroom for the arraignment of the Watergate burglars, and he's kind of just following through, taking notes, and then finally, when the judge asks James McCord, where he works, and he kind of mumbles Central Intelligence Agency, and you see Woodward's eyes light up, and he goes, "Holy shit!" We had a lot of those moments.
Did you almost feel like, did you have the out-of-body experience where you were hearing yourself talk, but that's what people used to say when they were conspiracy theorists?
Oh, absolutely. I think that was a constant experience of the Twitter files. Was this inner voice always tells you when you're reporting to be distrustful of any narrative or any story that sounds too conspiratorial. But I would be looking at these emails where it would be FBI, DHS, ODNI, and then OGA, which is other government agencies, which is CIA, meeting with Wikimedia and Twitter and Facebook.
Everyone had their roles to play, and you don't need a lot of coordination once you know what your role is. The role of the FBI to suppress and censor material about Hunter Biden, these groups to act as a way station for censorship requests to big tech, and for the media to report all of it.
It's the left, it's the power of the left, it's the power of groupthink, it's the power of the cancel culture mob. If you disagree with them, they rally around and come after you. And again, we've seen it time and time again. It was wrong what happened, and I think now the people get the facts and understand it. In the run-up to the 2020 presidential election, FBI Special Agent Elvis Chan, in his deposition in Missouri versus Biden, said that he repeatedly informed Twitter and other social media platforms of the likelihood of a hack and leak operation in the run-up to that presidential election. He did it even though there was no evidence. In fact, he said in his deposition that we hadn't seen anything, no intrusions, no hack, yet he repeatedly told him something was coming. We welcome everyone to the second hearing of the Select Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government.
It's terrifying, first of all. And second of all, it's consistent with our deposition of a FBI agent named Elvis Chan, who was working in the northern area of California, Northern California, who had monthly and then weekly meetings with big tech executives about what he was referring to as a potential Russian hack and leak operation. And in the sworn affidavit, an FEC affidavit from a senior Twitter person indicated that the Hunter Biden laptop was specifically mentioned as a hack and leak operation by the Russians. Knowing, by the way, in the fall and winter of 2019, the FBI had possession of the Hunter Biden laptop.
Now stop and think about it. So the government was telling big tech that there's going to be a hack and dump operation, when it's going to happen in October, who it's going to involve Hunter Biden. So what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, who it's going to involve. And you step back and you say, how did they know? These guys are prophetic. How could they see the future?
I figured that pressure would be brought to bear. As soon as I started seeing the names FBI, DHS on some of these documents, I knew this wasn't going to last very long. But once I saw that, once I started to see emails and Slack chats where there were recommendations from state agencies and federal law enforcement and even intelligence agencies about content moderation, I decided that that was the area that I wanted to focus on. And as a result, we were able to really determine sort of one important thing, which was the line of communication that existed between the federal agencies and companies like Twitter, along with the internecine communications that were going on.
They had set up a private portal to communicate with the government, which included DOD, the FBI, it included HHS, just included a lot of agencies, to include what you hear them refer to as, other government agency, which we all know is the CIA. There was a lot more going on than just a strategic relationship. The FBI and a number of other agencies were actually censoring Americans.
On August 6, 2020, the FBI briefed Senators Grassley and Johnson, and according to the senator's testimony, last month in front of this committee, the briefing was bogus and done so someone could go leak that the briefing had happened and undermine the senator's investigation.
Not only were they working with big tech to try to prep the battlefield and make sure it'd be censored, but folks in the Senate were figuring out what Hunter was up to, and it looked like the FBI went up and gave a briefing whose sole purpose was to leak to the media to say this could be disinformation.
In September of 2020, government-funded think tank gets involved. They do a tabletop exercise. The participants include the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other mainstream media outlets. Facebook is there. Mr. Roth of Twitter is there. The organizer was the former CEO of NPR and the former head of news at Twitter. The mock exercise is hosted by the Aspen Institute.
We are not here merely for a pleasant stay in the mountains, to hear a few speeches and then go back to the mess that we are in.
The Aspen Institute is a very, very influential think tank. It's sort of the American counterpart to the World Economic Forum. I mean, it's obviously not on that scale, but it's very extravagantly funded. It gets money from lots of different sources, including from the US military. But it's where sort of establishment neoliberal intellectuals gather to decide policy, mostly, out of the eyes of the public.
These agencies or these groups served as cutouts for the government to censor Americans. This is a coordinated, collusive effort backed by billions of dollars to censor everyone in the world, practically speaking. And Americans have special rights under our First Amendment.
So the government's paying someone else, and they're trying to influence these other organizations to censor Americans' First Amendment free speech.
In 2020, the Aspen Institute held what they called a hack and leak tabletop exercise to prepare for the possibility that a story would come out about Hunter Biden and Burisma. Like, it was that specific. They in July and August of 2020, this institute was inviting prominent journalists, academics, and people from civil society organizations to get together and wargame.
It's just a bunch of people in the room wargaming a particular scenario that they think may occur, and then, in the end, they're kind of fixing the narrative of how they will respond to that certain scenario. They were preparing for a story to come out.
FBI knows it's legit, knows it's real, and then is telling, is sort of pre-bunking this Hunter Biden laptop story and the contents of it ahead of time. And they also, according to Miranda Devine, had access to her emails and knew exactly when the story was going to be published. I mean, again, this is out of some sort of Orwellian novel, but it was happening in the United States of America leading up to the 2020 election.
They had the laptop in their possession for a year. And Schellenberger writes about this in, I think it's Twitter Files number 7, where he spells it all out. And he used, I thought, an appropriate term. He said, it was like the government was pre-bunking a story that they knew was likely to come out. And the reason they could pre-bunk it is because they had had the laptop in their possession for 10 months prior to that.
So here you have people from the New York Times, like David Sanger, from the Washington Post, like Ellen Nakashima, she's a big national security reporter. Garrett Graff, who is both at the Aspen Institute but also writing for Wired at the same time. There are reporters from CNN, from other organizations. They're all coming to this thing where they are planning in advance how to deal with a true story about Hunter Biden and his connections to Burisma.
A lot of these so-called journalists have just simply become advocates. And, journalism, I mean, when, the investigative journalist that's exposing corruption, that's a very important role to play in our society.
And I think it's shocking the number of so-called journalists that are perfectly willing to go along to parrot the talking points of the current administration.
Basically what they do, they are preparing for how to discount and non-report and non-cover the story. The thing that's remarkable for me is that when the actual Burisma story broke in the New York Post, when Hunter Biden's laptop was reported on by the Post in October, the existence of this tabletop exercise instantly became newsworthy.
So that tabletop exercise is interesting. So what the left is, they have this narrative about 2016, where you had a series of leaks of emails that allegedly taken by the Russians. No one disputed the authenticity of the emails, but they were politically problematic. So 2020 comes around and they say, okay, well, are there going to be leaks of other information that is true that's going to be politically problematic? How do we handle the release of true information that hurts our candidate? And the plan was to just censor it, attribute it to Russian misinformation, and censor it.
All the people who were there and reporting on this, even if it was off the record, they should have been deeply nervous because, oh my God, we participated in this thing, preparing to non-cover a huge story involving a presidential candidate. This is going to come out. I either have to report on this or admit it or something. None of them did. They all quietly non-reported the existence of this thing, with the exception of Wired. Wired did a little notation saying that the exercise had happened. They all kind of stuck together, and it's remarkable, right? Because I was raised as a journalist. You're on the side of the public. The public wants to know this stuff.
This story should have been out there. The American people should have been able to make their own determination of how that affected their vote. And the idea that government was working with the press and with big tech to suppress that ought to scare the bejesus out of everybody.
How could that happen, And then we see stuff like the Aspen Institute business, where it's a whole bunch of journalists agreeing sort of tacitly to do something that's totally unethical. And how does that happen? How do you trust another person in the room isn't going to think on you to, the rest of the world? I thought that was remarkable. When I saw those documents, I thought, man, this must be a deeply entrenched system if they're so comfortable doing this kind of thing and, not worrying that this is going to come out.
Finally, as if on cue, 5 days later, on October 19th, 51 former Intel officials signed a letter with the now famous sentence, "The Biden laptop story has all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation."
Look, they all knew adverse information about Hunter and Joe Biden was going to come out, and they all knew what to do when it happened. And I don't think you needed to make a lot of phone calls once it came out for them to start pushing their narratives. I mean, how many phone calls did it take to get that 51-person letter to be signed, lying to the American people about Hunter laptop being disinformation? Well, by the documents we're seeing, not that many phone calls, all of which were originating from the Biden campaign.
The guy who put the whole letter together, Mike Morrell, former acting director of the CIA, he said we did it because we wanted Joe Biden to have something to use against President Trump in the final debate, and we wanted that because we wanted Joe Biden to win. It was with their title. All 51 had their title on there, giving it the weight that this has got to be accurate, when in fact it wasn't.
Well, it gave a talking point to Joe Biden that the media could also echo and latch on to, that this story was to be ignored and cast aside. And it was an abuse of these individual security clearances, because we trust them because they have national security clearances. They have access to information the rest of us don't have. And they put out a political talking point that was based on political expediency rather than a truthful analysis of what the laptop was and what its implications were.
Well, it reminds you a lot of psychological operations. I mean, the military's been doing psychological operations for a long time, and you had a concerted effort by multiple government agencies, which kind of meddled in our election, it meddled in the COVID affairs and other things, as far as trying to influence Americans or sway their opinions. in a different way, or even censor Americans who, who spoke out against the narrative that was being pushed.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
In his 1961 farewell address, President Dwight Eisenhower warned of, quote, the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower feared that the size and power of the complex, or cluster, of government contractors and the Defense Department would, quote, endanger our liberties or democratic processes. Through, quote, domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money. He feared public policy would become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. Eisenhower's fears were well-founded. Today, American taxpayers are unwittingly financing the growth and power of a censorship industrial complex run by America's scientific and technological elite, which endangers our liberties and democracy.
We've never had a situation where the major distribution networks for the country, for news, were told to step on a story or voluntarily stepped on a story of that consequence heading into a presidential election. I mean, you'd have to go back to the Pentagon Papers to see even an attempt in that direction. And it was remarkable to me to see the non-response from journalists who ought to care about this, because that could be your story next.
Shutting down the ability of the New York Post to post content was an extraordinary escalation, and it was done at the behest of the government. There's no doubt that deep state actors, and Twitter Files is pretty explicit here, had prepped the battlefield, not only for Twitter to take action, but Zuckerberg's admitted that, they were warning us something like this was going to come.
The FBI, I think, basically came to us, some folks on our team, and was like, hey, just so you know, like, you should be on high alert. We thought that there was a lot of Russian propaganda in the 2016 election. We have it on notice that basically there's about to be some kind of dump that's similar to that. So just be vigilant.
We must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
So it's big government, big tech, big media, but also the in-between many times is NGOs, these not-for-profits, these organizations out there, in some cases universities, or think tanks on university, whatever you want to call them. Money gets funneled there, that gets put into place at big tech in trying to influence them, or somewhere else.
Civil society organizations are supposed to watch the government, the news media is supposed to watch both, the tech platforms are supposed to have different interests from the government, but what we see in the censorship industrial complex is they're all working together in what they call the shared endeavor, and so it's a consolidation of power. That's the model that they're looking for.
Well, I think we just have to come to terms with the fact that the big tech companies, or social media companies, are partisan leftist ideologues. And they've been lying about the reasons they've been, quote, moderating content. They've been censoring content, not following a set of rules, but following government dictates and their own ideological predilections and political biases. But you can't trust these big tech companies. They aren't moderating content in any honest way. They're either acting on behalf of the government, which is arguably illegal, at least on the government side, and to the degree they're doing it without government input, it's dishonestly being done.
That's why we're actually talking. We've sent letters to these folks trying to get information from some of these organizations, like the Stanford Institute. So. But that's this censorship industrial complex, or as I think even Jonathan Turley said, he used a similar term. He said censorship by surrogate. So the government's paying someone else, and they're trying to influence these other organizations to censor Americans' First Amendment free speech.
One of the things that motivated me to run for the United States Senate, to get here, to pull this back, to fundamentally dismantle the administrative state. What's happened is Congress has willingly ceded this authority to these faceless agencies who've gotten more and more power.
I had heard from a source who had worked with Renee that Renee had talked about being in the CIA, but I didn't report that because I didn't have a second source. Until Michael Schellenberger and I met up with Mike Benz of the Foundation for Freedom Online, and he found a video of Alex Stamos introducing her as having worked for the CIA.
I'm really happy to announce for the first time that Renee DiResta will be joining us as our research manager. Renee, you can wave. Renee, yeah, let's give her a hand. Yes. You may know Renee from such reports as the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence's report on Russian interference. Renee has done a lot of writing and analytics. She has a computer science background like me. She is part of the academic unwashed with a computer science degree from a public university, but has gone out and worked for the CIA.
Now, when we did that report, she says that her only link to the CIA is that she was a fellow in her student years. So, okay, I mean, that's where things stand as we are. I mean, the three pieces of information are those, right? But there are a lot of people in this world who move freely back and forth between intelligence agencies, the so-called civil society organizations, federal law enforcement, tech companies, and even media. You know, you'll see people from the CIA all over Twitter, people from the NSA, the National Security Council, some of the key people who are actually characters in the Twitter files. We don't identify them that way, but some of them are CIA veterans, right? In the same way, right, we now see openly on channels like MSNBC and CNN, every day they've got, contributors who were former FBI or CIA or NSC officials. Sometimes they're even anchors.
Yeah, what's interesting is that a lot of these so-called non-governmental organizations who are opposed to disinformation have been implicated in actually putting out false information to smear those the left doesn't like, whether it be Roy Moore in Alabama or Trump and Republicans generally.
This came out, they got busted doing it. And there was a story in the New York Times, they admitted it. And yet, it somehow doesn't cause anybody to reassess, for instance, New Knowledge's testimony about Russian bots in the Trump-Russia investigation. So here you have a company that's been caught manufacturing a Russian bot scandal, and they have also given a report to the Senate on Russian bots in the 2016 election, and nobody makes that connection? Like, do we reassess any of that information?
So in August 2020, students from the Stanford Internet Observatory were doing an internship with CISA, and they identified a massive gap in the capability of federal, state, and local governments to become aware of, to analyze, and to rapidly respond to mis and disinformation, both foreign and domestic, targeting the 2020 election.
Renee was the research director of the company at the time this was going on, and yet she's running the election integrity partnership, and nobody thinks that's weird. So yeah, it's stuff like that over and over again. One of the people who writes for my site, Racket, Andrew Lowenthal, he made the point, these people who are professing to be the leading experts on combating disinformation, in many cases they have records of being agents of disinformation themselves, which should cause people to do a double take, but it doesn't.
I don't think people understood the extent of the election interference until the Twitter files. And to be clear, if you censor information about one candidate, negative information, while censoring another candidate who's trying to get his message out, that is election rigging as surely as stuffing ballot boxes.
Well, I'm just going to say, well, even look more recently. Maybe it'd be nice if the government would just let we the people decide who we want to get elected. who we want in office, who we want representing us. Because if you think about it, that in 2016, the FBI got involved with, it was the whole dossier Russia thing that they were doing to President Trump. In 2018, it was the Mueller investigation, the special counsel investigation. In 2020, it was the suppression of the laptop story that we were just talking about. In 2022, it was 91 days before the midterm election, the FBI raids President Trump's home. And here we are in 2024, we're still talking about just stay out of it.
We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow.
The number of people who are dying around the country because they're getting misinformation that is leading them to not take a vaccine. Young people, old people, kids, children, this is all a lot of them are being impacted by misinformation.
Virtually all of the COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths continue to be among the unvaccinated.
I think there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies about that, and that's really unfortunate. My job is to do what I can as a scientist to preserve and protect the health of the American public, and indirectly, in many respects, the health of the world.
Dr. Anthony Fauci. COVID-19 cases.
Coronavirus. The NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute.
Well, I think that what we had seen during COVID, in the lead up to the 2020 election, we saw this just massive effort by the federal government to work with big tech to suppress dissenting views. And that's an un-American thing to do. And so we filed a lawsuit. It was a landmark lawsuit. And what we uncovered in that lawsuit was a vast censorship enterprise, broader and bigger than anybody could have ever imagined. And so I think once we got into it, we were even more emboldened to continue to push forward, because whether it was, when Anthony Fauci spoke, big tech censored, or the Hunter Biden laptop, or just these special channels that had been established between big tech and big government, it needed to be exposed, and we got to make sure it never happens again.
This material might be the most important material we've found about the potential origins of COVID, and certainly the big lies put out there by the Fauci agency that it had nothing to do with gain-of-function research in Wuhan. When you say you're creating mutant coronaviruses in order to figure out how they can infect humanized mice, that's gain-of-function 101, and we've got proof positive here with these documents.
This paper that you were referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function. Let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans,
right.
You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct.
Understand, we now know that Dr. Fauci gave our tax dollars to a lab in Wuhan, China that wasn't up to code, that was doing gain-of-function research, and that's where the leak came from. That is almost, I believe that just as sure as I'm sitting here talking to you. But I think most people who have common sense now, and who follow this now understand that. I think Fauci knew that from the get-go, and he couldn't have that out. He couldn't have Dr. Fauci in his fiefdom handing out billions of dollars over the years, highest paid guy in the government, Mr. Know-it-all, Dr. Fauci. He couldn't let that get out that he had been using our money to fund gain-of-function research, and he knew it from the very get-go.
We also, in that deposition, confronted him with an email very early on in 2020 where a friend said, hey, Anthony Fauci, I'm getting on a plane. Should I be wearing a mask? And he responds, no, masks are ineffective. Then, of course, our school kids are subjected, 5-year-olds are subjected to wearing masks all day long, and we know the negative outcomes now. And so anybody that objected to this, anybody who stood up to, this sort of COVID authoritarianism, this biomedical authoritarianism that existed, they were deplatformed.
You had government officials debating whether it was a lab leak, but God forbid Americans wanted to debate it. They got censored because these government officials decided that the debate was too dangerous to have.
January 31st, 2020, Dr. Fauci gets an email from Dr. Christian Anderson, one of these virologists he's given our money to. That email said, now remember, this is right at the start, January 31st, 2020, he gets this email and says, virus looks engineered, virus is not consistent with evolutionary theory. That is a fancy way of saying this thing came from a lab. And Fauci goes into, he starts emailing people, his top assistant at midnight, he's doing another email, 2 in the morning, organizes a conference call the next day. He gets on this conference call with 10 virologists from around the country who've all got our money. By the way, one of the guys on the call, Dr. Gary, also says that, I don't know how this happens in nature, it'd be easy to do in a lab, on February 1st on this call. And then 3 days later, everybody changes their story. Anderson and Gary, who said it came from a lab, give a 180-degree shift and say, you're crazy, you're a conspiracy theorist if you think it came from a lab. Why did they change? The only intervening event is Fauci's phone call with these guys. And I'm convinced Fauci said, we got to get our story straight. We can't let it get out that it was gain-of-function research happening at a lab in China where this thing came from. So I think it was all about covering his backside. That's why they called us all crazy. If we even questioned that this idea that it came from a bat to a pangolin to a hippopotamus to Joe Rogan, and then we all get, the virus. Like, give me a break. I'm just a country boy, but I can kind of suspect, like, probably came from the lab in Wuhan, China, where they were doing this kind of experiments.
Well, I mean, early on it was easy to see why they were sensitive about it, because Judicial Watch obtained documents, I think it was last year, that showed almost immediately they were worried about what they were doing at that Wuhan Institute. They wanted to know what projects that were being funded, and reporting to Fauci and other top officials at National Institutes of Health and elsewhere about what these projects were. And we uncovered that they were engaged in gain-of-function research. So one of the reasons, in my view, especially now given the recent revelation that they were funding what they called the creation of mutant coronaviruses, that if indeed it was a lab leak, they were partly responsible for the virus that got out. Because unless it was a natural virus, it would have had to have been engineered. And if it was engineered, it was almost certainly as a result of the gain-of-function research either directly funded or the techniques that we taught the Chinese that resulted in COVID-19. Now, all those are big ifs, but it certainly helps explain why that part of the debate they didn't want the public talking about. And this is, talk about arrogance.
Information laundering is really quite ferocious. It's when a huckster takes some lies and makes them sound precocious by saying them in Congress or a mainstream outlet. So disinformation's origin seems slightly less atrocious.
Around the same time we filed the lawsuit, they were actually, the Biden administration was actually talking about a ministry of truth, a disinformation governance board in the United States of America. So this sort of Orwellian view that this administration has about censoring Americans. And let's be clear, it's illegal for the government to censor points of view they don't like.
To the point about the Disinformation Governance Board, that's how brazen it's become, that they were literally going to have some federal agency, a person in charge of some board, determine what Americans are allowed to say, what they're not allowed to say.
Federal government officials, agencies, and contractors have gone from fighting ISIS recruiters and Russian bots to censoring and deplatforming ordinary Americans and disfavored public figures.
Yes, we will be under the watchful eye of people who are intellectually dishonest, shallow, mendacious, manipulative. Because why? Because you can't believe in this system of information delivery and control unless there's something wrong with you. Unless you have a deeply pessimistic and I would say even sociopathic view of the human race, you can't view the information landscape and say, we need to keep all of this stuff secret from people and only give them information that allows them to think in a certain direction. Like, only a certain kind of person thinks that way, and they're all in this space. A lot of the value of the Twitter files was just people seeing the unredacted version of reality before news organizations could get counter-story together. And people have memories of that, and that's going to delay the whatever this political consolidation process is, it's going to at least delay it. So I'm not giving up hope yet, but with the internet and with the kind of general political climate where there's so much cooperation between, Western NATO bloc countries, you could have a consensus about what people see all over the world, and that could happen very quickly, and I'm worried about that.
No one has done more to uncover the falsehoods about the vaccine and COVID propaganda we've been force-fed. And we're also trying to hold them directly accountable by suing over the violations of our civil rights as a result of the censorship. And hopefully that will have a national impact too. Right now, American civil rights are being violated. Their First Amendment freedoms are being curtailed in a way we've never seen before. Judicial Watch thinks this is urgent, so we've deployed a lot of resources, both in terms of investigation and litigation, and obviously educating Americans about what's at stake here.